that the Bureau of Prisons gets to decide. The Bureau of Prisons is run independently from the FBI, from the U.S. Attorney's Office, from the judiciary, and who knows where the person's going to go. That's just how it happens.
Right.
So for Ghislaine Maxwell to have been transferred to actually a prison that has very, very minimal security and is just not fit for someone who's been convicted of horrible crimes against.
The same government now releasing the Jeffrey Epstein files is the one that quietly handed him a secret plea deal in 2008 and allowed him to avoid real consequences. Today, the U.S. Department of Justice is unveiling names tied to power, figures across politics, technology, and even royalty, along with emails and images pointing to a trafficking operation that functioned openly for years. But that raises an unavoidable contradiction. This is the very institution that once suppressed a case, enabling Epstein to continue his actions long after authorities first had the chance to stop him. So every new release doesn't just
Again, there was new names in some of the emails that I think investigators need to look at. In particular, I jumped on the name of a modeling agent who, in a similar fashion to Jean-Luc Brunel, who brought underage girls from overseas to Jeffrey Epstein for abuse. There was another man. What was interesting about this other individual is that he also apparently provided young models for Donald Trump's modeling agency.
The past. It revives a deeper question the system has never fully addressed. Why is this coming out now? And how much remained hidden while the truth was delayed? A similar contradiction hangs over the case involving Sean Combs. Back in 2016, Usher appeared on Howard Stern's show and spoke about living with Combs at just 13. He described an environment no teenager should be exposed to, late nights stretching into morning, unfamiliar adults coming and going, and an atmosphere that raised more questions than answers. When asked if he would ever allow his own children into what had been dubbed Puffy Camp, his response was immediate and unequivocal. No. The interview wasn't hidden or obscure. It aired on one of the most widely heard radio platforms in the country. Yet for nearly 8 years, it triggered no visible action. What ultimately shifted the trajectory wasn't new evidence, but mounting external pressure. In March 2024, U.S. Homeland Security investigations carried out coordinated raids on Combs' properties in Los Angeles and Miami, transforming years of civil allegations into a full-scale federal criminal probe. Months later, he was arrested and charged with human trafficking and racketeering conspiracy, and is now being held in a federal detention facility in Brooklyn awaiting trial in May 2025. Still, the gap between what was publicly known and when authorities acted remains unresolved. Usher's statements were already on record. The individuals involved were high-profile. The alleged patterns were not hidden, yet it took raids and public scrutiny to force movement. The release of the Jeffrey Epstein files reinforces this uneasy pattern. It shows that exposure can happen, but also that it does not guarantee accountability. One example cited is a 2012 email exchange involving Elon Musk, where he reportedly inquired about visiting Epstein's island and asked which night would host the most extreme...
So why do you think Epstein became almost like the central figure for all of this corrupt global elite meta cartel?
Well, he's just a microcosm of it, really. But I think
is it his own
he became too exposed, I think, especially after his first arrest. And as he described that he became radioactive, but he had, before been able to move through all these different...
gathering. That account stands in direct tension with Musk's public claims that he declined such invitations. Now preserved in official records, the contradiction is stark. Yet even with that level of documentation, there have been no formal consequences tied to discrepancy, no investigation into visit, no legal fallout, no accountability beyond reputational damage. And that is the deeper pattern these cases reveal. Exposure alone does not close the story. When revelations surface without enforcement to follow, the narrative doesn't end. It lingers unresolved. The archive of ignored warning signs stretches back decades. In 1998, Mel Gibson gave an interview that only recently resurfaced in full, with Snopes publishing a complete transcript to clarify its context after renewed attention around Sound of Freedom. In that conversation, Gibson spoke about arriving in Hollywood and developing what he described as an uneasy, almost paranoid awareness of something operating beneath the surface. He recalled encounters that disturbed him, stories of producers with extreme and dehumanizing views about women, and a moment with Christopher Walken that left him deeply unsettled, questioning what he had just experienced. At the time, those remarks were brushed aside, and Gibson himself faced well-documented resistance within the industry, particularly during the release of The Passion of the Christ, which he said drew backlash tied to his refusal to compromise his beliefs. What once sounded fringe is now being re-examined in a very different climate. The release of files tied to Jeffrey Epstein has placed a wide network of influential figures into the public record, including Bill Clinton, Prince Andrew, Richard Branson, and Steve Tisch. Their documented connections, regardless of context or degree, underscore how close proximity to power shaped the scope of the case. What sharpens a contradiction is institutional continuity. The same federal system now pursuing Sean Combs is the one that granted Epstein his 2008 non-prosecution agreement, a deal that kept many victims out of court and allowed him to maintain his lifestyle.
He talks in this complaint, Reed, about fearing for his life, not just while he was working for Sean Combs, but afterwards. He tells stories about physical violence, about a time where he actually had to drive 100 miles an hour to try to escape Mr. Combs, and says he didn't call the police because he worried that that would be a sentence.
Travel freely and continue operating. Years later, when coded language allegedly linked to exploitation surfaced in investigative materials, it pointed back to networks that had already been shielded once before. The scale of what remains unresolved is evident even outside the criminal charges. More than a dozen civil lawsuits have been filed against Combs, with one attorney alone representing over 100 alleged victims. Civil cases operate under a lower burden of proof, but the volume and consistency of claims suggest a pattern that extends beyond what is outlined in the indictment. While the criminal trial is scheduled for May, the civil litigation could stretch on for years, bringing forward depositions, sworn testimony, and additional allegations long after the government's case concludes. The system is clearly in motion now, but its pace tells its own story. The timeline unfolding today was not set by those coming forward, but by institutions that waited. The distance between exposure and accountability is what defines the instability of this moment. The documents tied to Jeffrey Epstein indicate that Elon Musk coordinated a visit to the island, yet no legal action is followed. They also reference Steve Tisch asking whether a woman was professional or civilian, a detail that triggered a response in the National Football League, which
They saw the evidence in the case. They immediately honed in on racketeering, and they started saying, why is this racketeering with one guy? And they're charging this one guy. They had a real problem with that. They did not have a problem with the Mann Act. They found him guilty on the Mann Act. And they hung 6-6 on...
announced a review of his ownership stake in the New York Giants. That qualifies as consequence, but it falls short of justice. In another case, Miroslav Lajčák stepped down from his government role after his communications surfaced. But resignations and internal reviews are not the same as criminal accountability. They leave the narrative in suspension, exposed but unresolved, waiting to see whether the legal system will ever align with what the documents suggest. That same imbalance is visible in the case against Sean Combs. The criminal charges he faces are significant, but they represent only a fraction of what is described in the civil lawsuits. Those filings outline allegations of coercion, environments where consent was blurred or compromised, and situations where hospitality crossed into obligation. One complaint describes a teenager allegedly being told that participation in certain acts was the cost of access to a music career. Another details claims of a woman being transported across state lines for events. The divide between what the criminal indictment addresses and what civil litigation alleges is substantial. It suggests that the full scope of the story may still be incomplete, and may remain that way until testimony is compelled under oath. Until then, the gap persists